Have you ever thought about how some religious beliefs can influence medical decisions involving life and death? Among the most intriguing is the refusal to accept blood transfusions, even in critical situations. Today we're going to deal with a topic that arouses a lot of curiosity and at the same time generates intense debate in both the religious and medical fields. Why don't Jehovah's Witnesses accept blood transfusions? If you go to the official website of Jehovah's Witnesses, you'll see that this refusal is defended as a matter of faith and not just a medical decision. They argue that both the Old and New Testaments clearly command abstention from blood. One of the passages most used for this argument is found in the book of Genesis, chapter 9, verse 4, which reads, "But flesh with its life, that is, with its blood, you shall not eat." The interpretation given by the Jehovah's Witnesses is that this passage establishes an absolute ban on any use of blood, including transfusions. As a consequence of this belief, believers in the Jehovah's Witness reject this procedure even in life-threatening cases, trusting that God will provide another means of survival. But is this interpretation correct? Does the Bible really forbid blood transfusions, or is this a misinterpretation? To understand this question, we need to examine not just one isolated verse, but the whole context of the passage. Genesis 9:4 comes just after the flood, when God establishes new guidelines for humanity. One of these rules was to allow men to eat meat, something that had not been mentioned until then. However, there was a limit. They were not to eat meat with its blood still present. But why? In ancient times, some cultures had brutal practices related to blood. The consumption of raw meat, still containing blood, was common among pagan peoples, often associated with religious rituals and even human sacrifices. Thus, this prohibition was not related to medical procedures, but to a context of respect for life and the separation between God's people and the pagan nations. If we continue reading in verse 5, we see an important complement. "I will surely require your blood, the blood of your life. From every animal I will require it, as well as from the hand of man. Yes, from the hand of every man's neighbor I will require the life of man." What is this text telling us? Here, God establishes a fundamental principle. Human life is sacred and must be protected. Blood, as a symbol of life, could not be treated in any way. Furthermore, this passage introduces the idea of justice and the need for a civil system that protects life and punishes those who take it unjustly. And it is at this point that we find an essential detail. The text is not dealing with medicine, science, or blood transfusions, but with a moral and civil principle. In addition to Genesis 9:4, Jehovah's Witnesses also rely on other passages to reinforce their position, such as Leviticus 17:10-14 and Acts 15:28-29, which speak of the need to abstain from blood. But do these passages really forbid transfusions? In the case of Leviticus, we see that the command was for the Israelites not to ingest animal blood, as it was to be poured out as an offering to God. In Acts 15, the apostles recommend that Christians abstain from blood, but the context shows that this command was related to pagan practices and idolatrous sacrifices. Don't forget to leave your likes, subscribe to the channel, and leave your opinion in the comments. The big question is, are these passages about modern medicine or about the cultural and religious context of the time? What we have to consider is that a blood transfusion is not the same as ingesting blood. When someone receives a transfusion, they are not consuming blood as food, but rather receiving it as a means of survival. The intention here is not to disrespect God's law, but to preserve life, something that ironically the Bible itself considers sacred. Now imagine the following situation. You're in hospital at your daughter's bedside, and the doctor tells you that she urgently needs a blood transfusion. Without it, she won't survive. What would you do? If you were a parent who followed the faith of Jehovah's Witnesses, you would be faced with a difficult dilemma. On the one hand, there's your religious belief, based on the interpretation of certain texts. On the other, there is the life of their own child, which could be saved with a simple transfusion. Would God condemn someone for doing everything to save the life of a loved one? Doesn't the Bible teach that love of neighbor is one of the greatest commandments? After all, to what extent should faith guide our medical decisions? Throughout the Scriptures, God shows himself to be a defender of life. In John 10:10, Jesus states, "I have come that they may have life and have it to the full." This verse reminds us that God's purpose is not to impose rules that lead people to death, but to offer paths that lead to life. It's important to remember that science and medicine are gifts that can be used to save lives. Christ himself healed the sick, restored people's health, and never imposed medical restrictions that put anyone at risk. If a blood transfusion can save a person's life, would such a decision really be reprehensible in God's eyes? When we analyze the biblical texts in their context, we realize that there is no passage prohibiting blood transfusions. The passages used to justify this practice have been interpreted out of their original context, without taking into account advances in science and the difference between ancient rituals and modern medical procedures. This means that each person has the right to make their own decision, but this choice must be made with knowledge and discernment, and not just on the basis of an isolated interpretation. After all, if life is a divine gift, shouldn't we do everything in our power to preserve it? What do you think about this issue? Do you agree or disagree with Jehovah's Witnesses' position on blood transfusion? Leave your comment below. I really want to know what you think about this issue. And of course, if this video has brought you knowledge and made you think, don't forget to leave a like. It really helps the channel to grow and reach more people. Subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you don't miss out on upcoming videos. Your participation is essential for us to continue this work.